Something shifted last night, and I don't mean tactically, I mean structurally. When Iranian ballistic missiles began impacting American forward operating positions across the Middle East theater, and the United States responded with coordinated air and naval strikes targeting Iranian military infrastructure, most people watching their television screens saw a breaking news ticker, they saw explosions, they saw press conferences, they saw retired generals explaining blast radii and munitions yield. But what they didn't see, what they were never going to see on that screen, was the architecture behind the moment. The scaffolding, the reasons that were built over years, maybe decades, that made this exact exchange not just possible, but arguably inevitable. And here's the critical realization I want you to hold on to, because I'm going to come back to it in the final part of this conversation. The most dangerous thing happening right now is not the missiles themselves. It's the story being told about them. Because whoever controls the narrative of this conflict controls what comes next. And what comes next, I promise you, is far more consequential than any single strike. So let's talk about what's actually happening, and more importantly, why. To understand the events of the last 72 hours, you cannot start with Iran. You cannot even start with the Middle East. You have to start with a much larger question, one that the foreign policy establishment in Washington has been quietly wrestling with for the better part of 15 years. And that question is this: what does American primacy look like in a world that has already begun organizing itself around alternatives to American primacy? That's not a rhetorical flourish. That is the actual strategic dilemma sitting at the center of everything you're watching unfold. The United States built its post-World War II architecture on a set of interlocking assumptions: that the dollar would remain the world's reserve currency, that American military reach would be uncontested in every meaningful theater, that allies would remain aligned, and that adversaries would remain isolated. Every one of those assumptions is now under active pressure, not theoretical pressure. Real, measurable, institutional pressure. Iran, in this context, is not simply a rogue state acting out of ideology, which is how it gets framed in the mainstream coverage. Iran is a node in a much larger network of nations that have made a calculated decision, and it genuinely is a calculation, not an accident, to resist the architecture of American-led unipolarity. That network includes Russia, it includes China in indirect but very important ways. It includes a growing number of global South nations that have watched the weaponization of the dollar-based financial system and drawn their own conclusions. When you see Iranian missiles hitting American bases, you are seeing the kinetic expression of a much deeper structural contest. The military exchange is almost secondary. It's the visible surface of something that runs much deeper. But to understand why this matters right now, at this particular moment in 2025, we have to look at the internal pressures inside Iran itself, because this is something that almost nobody in Western media is discussing with any real seriousness. The Iranian regime is not a monolith. It never has been. There are factions within the Revolutionary Guard, within the clerical establishment, within the foreign ministry, that have very different assessments of what confrontation with the United States actually costs Iran. The hardliners, and let's be precise, the specific network centered around elements of the IRGC that have the most to gain from perpetual confrontation, those actors have a vested institutional interest in escalation. Not because they want war in the existential sense, but because escalation justifies their budget, their authority, their relevance inside the Iranian power structure. This is something that gets lost entirely when you watch the news. You hear Iran fired missiles as if Iran is a single unified actor with a single unified intention. The geopolitical reality is far messier, far more human, and far more interesting than that. And on the American side, the same fragmentation exists. Think about what the current administration is actually managing. You have a Pentagon that is deeply concerned about force projection sustainability in a multi-front environment. You have a Treasury Department that is watching the dollar's share of global reserve holdings decline in ways that are slow but unmistakable. You have a State Department that is trying to manage relationships with Gulf partners who are increasingly hedging, increasingly talking to Beijing, increasingly skeptical that American security guarantees mean what they used to mean. And you have a domestic political environment in which the optics of appearing weak in the face of Iranian aggression are simply not survivable. So when those missiles hit American positions, the response was not purely strategic. It was partly strategic, partly political, partly institutional, a combination of pressures that produced a decision that might look decisive on television, but is actually far more complicated in its implications. Now, here's a question I genuinely want you to sit with, because I think it goes to the heart of what we're all trying to understand. What does victory actually look like in this scenario? not for either side in some abstract moral sense, but operationally, concretely, what is the definition of success? Because I would argue that neither Washington nor Tehran has a clean answer to that question, and the absence of a clean answer is precisely what makes this situation so combustible. When you don't know what winning looks like, you can't know when to stop, and conflicts where neither side knows when to stop have a very particular and very dangerous historical trajectory. The strikes that the United States conducted in response, targeting what officials described as missile production facilities, command infrastructure, and specific IRGC assets, were calibrated in that very particular way that American military action in the Middle East has been calibrated for the last 2 decades. They were designed to inflict cost without triggering the kind of escalation that would require a fundamentally different level of commitment. This is the logic of what strategists call escalation management. And on the chessboard of great power competition, it has a certain internal coherence. You hit hard enough to re-establish deterrence, not so hard that you force your adversary into a corner where their only remaining option is maximum retaliation. But here's the problem with that logic in this specific context. Iran has spent 15 years studying exactly how the United States manages escalation. They understand the thresholds, they understand where the red lines are drawn, and they have specifically designed their force posture, their proxy networks, their missile arsenals to operate in the space just below those thresholds to accumulate strategic pressure without ever triggering the full weight of American military response. So when we strike their facilities, we are not resetting the chessboard, we are moving a piece on a board that they helped design. But to understand the full dimension of what's happening, we have to go beyond the military dimension entirely and look at what this moment means for the global economic architecture, because I think this is where the real story is being written. We are at a juncture where the petrodollar system, the arrangement that has underpinned American financial dominance since the early 1970s, is facing its most serious structural challenge since its inception. The Saudi-Chinese oil deal denominated in yuan, the BRICS expansion, the proliferation of bilateral currency arrangements that bypass the dollar. These are not isolated events. They are symptoms of a global majority that has decided, country by country, institution by institution, that the cost of dollar dependency has become too high. And what does Iran have to do with this? Everything, actually. Because Iran, sitting on the 3rd largest proven oil reserves in the world, fully integrated into alternative financial networks, sanctioned out of the dollar system and therefore with nothing left to lose from the dollar system's erosion, represents something that the architects of American financial power find genuinely threatening. Not because Iran alone can break the dollar system, it cannot, but because Iran is a proof of concept that survival outside the dollar system is possible. This is where I want to draw your attention to something that I think most analysts are systematically underestimating, and I'll tell you plainly what it is. The United States and Iran are not simply adversaries in the conventional sense. They are participants in a demonstration. Every time Iran absorbs American strikes and continues functioning, continues exporting oil, continues maintaining its alliances, continues exercising regional influence, every time that happens, it sends a signal to every other nation in the global south that the American toolkit of sanctions, financial exclusion, and periodic military punishment has limits. That signal is being received. It has been received in Riyadh, where the Crown Prince has been very deliberately expanding Chinese economic relationships. It has been received in Ankara, where NATO membership coexists with the purchase of Russian air defense systems. It has been received in New Delhi, where strategic autonomy has become the defining principle of foreign policy, regardless of which party holds power. The Middle East conflict is not peripheral to the question of global order. It is one of the primary theaters in which that question is being answered right now in real time, and this brings me to something I find profoundly important to address because it speaks to a shift in global morality, or perhaps more precisely, a shift in who gets to define what global morality means. There was a period roughly from 1991 to about 2008 when the American-led liberal international order carried genuine normative authority. When Washington said something violated international law, that statement carried weight, not just because America was powerful, but because a broad coalition of nations accepted the legitimacy of the framework being invoked. That period is over. It ended gradually and then suddenly through a series of decisions: the Iraq War, the treatment of detainees, the 2008 financial crisis and its aftermath, the Libya intervention and what happened after, the drone program's civilian toll, the weaponization of SWIFT against entire nations. Each of these events eroded the normative credibility that made American leadership something more than raw power. Today, when Washington frames military strikes on Iran as defensive, as rule-based, as proportionate, those claims land very differently in Jakarta, in Pretoria, in São Paulo than they do in Washington itself. This is not anti-American sentiment in the superficial sense. It is a rational recalibration by billions of people who have been watching carefully and drawing their own conclusions. Now let me ask you something directly, because I think this is worth your honest reflection. When you watch the coverage of these strikes, when you see the official briefings and the expert panels and the retired generals explaining the strategic rationale, do you feel like you're getting the complete picture, or do you feel like you're being handed a version of the picture that has been carefully edited for a particular effect? Because I think most of the people watching this channel have developed a very finely tuned sense for the difference between those two things. And that instinct, that sense that the official narrative is a partial truth at best, is not cynicism, it's pattern recognition. It's the product of watching how these situations get framed, how the historical record eventually diverges from the original framing, how the defensive action of today becomes the catastrophic miscalculation of the retrospective account written 5 years later. What concerns me most about the current trajectory, and I want to be very precise about this because I don't think imprecision serves anyone, is not the immediate military exchange. American and Iranian forces have fought each other directly and through proxies for years, and there are established, if brutal, routines to that competition. What concerns me is the interaction between this military escalation and a set of much larger systemic stresses that are operating simultaneously. We are in a period of profound dollar liquidity pressure globally. We are in a period where American domestic political cohesion is at a historic low point. We are in a period where Chinese economic expansion is being actively contested in ways that are creating secondary and tertiary effects across every region of the world. We are in a period where the European security architecture post-Ukraine is in genuine disarray. All of these stress points are interacting with each other, feeding back on each other, and the Middle East escalation is not happening in isolation from any of them. It is happening inside all of them simultaneously. And here's the thing about complex systems under multiple simultaneous stresses: they don't fail in predictable, manageable ways. They fail at the intersections. They fail where 2 or 3 stresses amplify each other in ways that no single actor anticipated or intended. That's not a counsel of despair, but it is a counsel of humility about the limits of what controlled escalation actually means in an environment this complex. What would a genuinely strategic American posture look like right now? I think it would involve taking seriously the question of what Iran actually needs to feel secure enough to step back from the precipice, not because Iran deserves sympathy in any naive moral sense, but because understanding what your adversary actually needs is the precondition for any durable resolution. It would involve taking seriously the concerns of all those global South nations that are watching and recalibrating, not with military pressure or financial coercion, but with a genuine reassessment of what the American proposition to the world actually is. And it would involve an honest internal conversation in Washington about whether the strategic goals being pursued in the Middle East are actually achievable with the tools being deployed, or whether those tools are being used repeatedly because they're familiar, not because they're effective. Which brings me back to the critical realization I mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation, the one I told you I would fully unpack. Here it is. The most dangerous thing happening right now is not the missiles. It's the story being told about the missiles, because the story, the framing of this as a straightforward defensive response to aggression, the framing of Iran as a uniquely irrational actor, the framing of American military action as reluctant but necessary, that story serves a very particular function. It forecloses alternatives. It makes every option that isn't military escalation look like weakness, look like appeasement, look like strategic retreat. And once you've foreclosed alternatives in the public mind, once you've made the escalatory path feel like the only responsible path, you have created a self-fulfilling logic that is extremely difficult to interrupt. History is full of conflicts that nobody actually wanted in their full realized horror. But that became impossible to stop because the story told about them made every off-ramp look like surrender. That is the architecture of what I think we're living through, not a simple story of aggression and response, a much more complex and much more consequential story about the end of one kind of world order and the violent, chaotic, deeply uncertain beginning of whatever comes next, and the citizens of the United States, the people who bear the actual costs of these decisions, in blood, in treasure, in credibility, in the slow erosion of the institutions they were told were serving them, Those people deserve a more complete account of what's happening than what they're being given. So tell me, what do you actually see when you look at this? What pattern do you recognize that the official account is leaving out? Because I think the people in this community see things that the mainstream analysis consistently misses, and that conversation, that collective intelligence, is exactly what this moment requires.